our own response. So Southwest had the big fiasco, right, with regards to scheduling. We all know that. And you had a number of people that were not getting scheduled until 5 days later, but there was great uncertainty, so they weren't even being scheduled, which obviously creates a lot of negative sentiment. The problem was that as people started talking and hoping for the best result, which was schedule me now, get me on a flight, what ended up happening was people not only didn't get responses, but then it was harder and harder to call in because everything was flooded, right? And the last thing that you want to do for a negative customer is then push them out to a bot, right? I think that that's kind of this feeling of what do you want? What did people want when they went through this experience at the Southwest? They wanted to talk to a human and they wanted them to know how mad they were. And yes, they wanted to have a solution, but they thought that if somebody could relate to them, that maybe there could be some compromise and some solution could be had, right? And this is an interesting kind of expectation that we have. We want empathy. So sentience becomes an important topic in AI then, right? Validation. You want that. And in fact, what you really want in that moment is for maybe the person that you're talking to feel so bad that there's some personal, like, right? Like it just, there's empathy there. Now, flip that out to a situation that I had with a telecom company when my internet connection went down. And I chatted with this telecom company. And they immediately responded by saying, here's $20. And then I did that again, maybe a month later when there was an outage. Here's $20. I could care less about talking to a human in that situation. I would rather actually increase and say, hey, actually I'd like 30 and the computer to give me $30. Then the more unreasonable the request, the less I want to interact with a human and the more I want to lean on an AI, right? Would you guys agree with that kind of, right? If it's an unreasonable, I want $800 and the computer gave it to me, I would then say, great, how about $900, right? We'd get more unreasonable because now there's this, great, they're giving me what I want. And so that's an interesting kind of paradigm here about the compartmentalization of when we want AI to make decisions for us, when our demands are met, when they're unreasonable demands. Compromise, what's part of compromise? Empathy. And so when we get kind of to these very kind of granular parts of the decision and breaking apart decision making, it's less about data all the time and more about emotion, more about feeling, right? Who's done a merger without saying I want to sleep on it, right? Like I want to think about this. I want to see how I feel. And that kind of goes from the individual now to the organizational, but the more consequential. We tend to rely on our feelings to make decisions. And if that wasn't the case, then we want unreasonable demands to be met. And when that happens, that's when we're okay with AI. And this is just one example, right? And this is kind of what Southwest, the people wanted at Southwest. If I could get scheduled automatically for when I want it, cool, right? I want to talk to a human. Let's just get this scheduled. Let me get on the plane. But if that wasn't going to be met, I want empathy. And I want some compromise. And I want to believe that through your empathy, I'm going to now have an opportunity to get on the earliest flight and you're going to make me believe that. Versus if you're going to push me to a chatbot that's not going to meet any of my demands, I'm going to be more livid and I'm never going to use you again, right? Yeah, comment. This is a great question. And Carter, you're kind of going, I'd like to kind of push on a little bit, but this is a great kind of feed in is like the expectation around the data and the expectation of the output. How do you set that up? How do you optimize that equation, right? I think that's kind of the root.
No, what I love about these types of discussions is that, my training is as a social scientist. I mean, my PhD is in criminology. And so during my training, I took a pile of stats courses and I love doing it. But you also take social psychology courses. You also get into psychometrics and everything. And I think you are hitting on something that I think is so fundamentally difficult to try to measure. And I used to have this conversation with my fellow nerds in my cohort when we were going through PhD. It's like, how do you capture and quantify love or something like that? What do you mean it's criminal behavior? You know, so how do you capture empathy with AI and fulfill the needs of that human on the other side of the chat? And, you know, this is why psychometrics exist. And this is why they're like, you know, you've got, factor analysis and PCA. And it's like, if this loads on that, and then you've got these factors, then you can go in and, you know, kind of rule of thumb, name these different factors. And I mean, it's very, very interesting stuff. But that's so hard to do. I mean, that is so hard to do. And especially if you're just chatting back and forth and your chatbot hasn't been trained on emotion. You know, so what I see a lot in with AI, however you define it in the tech industry, is like, well, if you've got a lot of data, you can learn something from it. And for me, and I will say this 1,000 times while I'm up here today, this all goes back to good fundamental research principles. Tyler mentioned it as well, you know, of just saying, hey, the basics are super important. For all of you who ever took those research methods courses and you freaking hated them to death, it was even more boring than your stats course that you never wanted to take, but you had to graduate. That research methods course, you might forget about a construct validity, internal validity, external validity. But what's your name? So what James just asked right here is so core to how are we going to make AI smarter to be able to help us like with really big, impactful decision making, is that can you quantify that social phenomena in some way? And can you feed it back to a human to where you take care of how they feel?
Can I ask a follow-up question here?
Please.
Yeah, so I think an interesting thing to add to this too is that we've seen with ChatGPT that it's trained to be creative. And as a consequence, it just makes a lot of stuff up. The next question is, if we start training AIs to have empathy, which is an interesting prospect, right, to connect with humans, do they then start do we start creating human cognitive errors in these systems? Like,
It's interesting. What do you guys think, Ben, Joe? I mean, what's your take on this? I mean, I think, you know, we're getting into also kind of the fundamentals, again, going back to the fundamentals of data, but like, you know, when you're training, when you're kind of learning, there's biases, right? There's that piece of this also with the expectation. It's like, do we want biased decision making from AI, like from organizational? No, like we don't want to like propagate that further, right? Heaven forbid. And especially if you think about this in terms of like a firing decision or a promotion decision where there's consequences on the interactions with people. Now, like, do you trust a pushing a button to make that decision for you, or it making the decision for you when you're sleeping at night? Do you want it to make those decisions for you on your team? I don't know. Like, let's talk a little bit more about the fundamentals, though, because I think that's a really good point, right?
Yeah, you said the word trust, which trust is actually well studied, especially within teams and humans. And there's three kind of core components to trust. It's generally authenticity. So are you authentic in your relationships? Second is rigor in your logic. So people don't trust you if you're not very rigorous. And third is empathy, which we've talked a lot about. Empathy usually actually comes more from listening and relating. And I actually think ChatGPT could be considered fairly empathetic. It does listen to you. And it probably will, if you're like, I'm having a bad day, would say something like, I'm very sorry. Like, it's not really judging you, but I don't think it's very authentic. And I think it lacks in its rigor of logic, which is to say it's hard for you to understand if what it's saying to you is rigorous. And so if you're saying, hey, should I fire half my company today? It will say something back, and it probably has zero rigor behind it and a lack of like authenticity, which is like, what does it mean to be authentic as a computer? I don't know. But it's hard as humans, what we found, to relate or to feel trust around something that's not authentic. Like if you called up Southwest and they really are just kind of like pushing you off, maybe they're listening to you, but just like they're not authentically engaging with you. I think you get this a lot if it's like a weather problem, right? You're calling up and you're like, the weather, and they're like, what do you want me to do, right? So I think thinking about those three components in an AI system is one, I think they need to get better at the rigor, which is not only just being rigorous, but also explaining the rigor. It's always been a challenge with AI. And a lot of times we just say, who cares? And we just make the prediction. Zillow got burned on this with their whole like, we'll buy your house and resell it. And turns out our logic was not very rigorous. But then authenticity, I think, is a really interesting one. It's like, how does a machine come off as authentic? I don't know.
So, and Joe, I want your take on this. And I actually, one part of authenticity is I think I just made a mistake, right? I said Ben instead of Tyler. But like authenticity, part of that is actually making mistakes. And I think that that's another piece of like what you just said. So I'm sorry about that, Tyler. But at the same time, there's authenticity in that, right? And it's interesting how can you manufacture authenticity through little things like making a mistake every now and then, not the spam, filter one where it's like, when you get the spam and it's like completely misspelled every third word, right? But the idea is there authenticity that can be manufactured in some way for some groups by just making one small mistake as one example, right?
Well, you mentioned mistakes. It's interesting. I can't remember the phenomenon, but it's like I think humans are a lot more forgiving when another human makes a mistake. But if they see a machine make a mistake, it's like, the next time they see it, it's like, this thing's stupid. I'm not going to deal with it. And so that's interesting thing about mistakes, right? Because it's all about the messenger in a lot of ways too, and then the person who made the mistakes. Carter's, you're a criminologist and whatnot. It kind of reminds me of did you watch that old movie Blade Runner? Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that. You're trying to figure out like, who's the replicant and who's not. So basically the premise of the movie for people who don't know is, people decided it'd be a great idea to make synthetic humans with, AI-powered synthetic brains. And the question is whether or not they're human or not, right? So it was the Tyrell company, I think it was, that made them. It was, I think their slogan was more human than human. Which is also a really bad white zombie song. But it kind of speaks to the point, right? Because I mean, the job of the protagonist in the movie was to basically go hunt down these replicants and figure out who they were and kill them because they got a mind of their own and all this stuff. So it's interesting seeing like we're having these sort of discussions now. It feels like these are like 20 years. Actually, Blade Runner was supposed to happen like right now, actually. But interesting discussions. But I guess when it comes to questions of firing, though, like, Google had the mass layoff the other day, and by all accounts, it was really poorly executed. And I'm like, well, if you just flipped a coin, what would do better, ChatGPT or, whoever decided to make those firing decisions there, right? So I don't know. That's just it. The fact that I actually don't have an answer for that because I think the humans did a pretty crap job at it, frankly. So, but this is, when it comes to tough decisions, I don't know.
So, Joe, on this, like, actually to follow this up, like Tesla, I remember going out to Google X for a research meeting, and we met with all of the heads of all of these departments of Google X, and one of them was the self-driving, right? And I remember kind of the topic coming up, like, how do you guys think about when a self-driving makes a mistake? And certainly, there's consequences to that, and we're seeing that play out now, which is more in the legal side, who's responsible, right? But what's interesting that's played out there is, do you notice how their philosophy back then was, look, we are saving tons of lives statistically by doing this. That one person that died, right? Really sorry about that. Like that's a big deal, but we are statistically improving life. And yet in the news, what do you see, right? What's the sentiment when there's a self-driving car that crashes and it burns and the person unfortunately dies? What ends up happening is we basically judge this company very harshly, right? And part of this is actually just part of the media that wants to sensationalize that, but it does throw rationality out the window with regards to like, what is the ultimate good? The ultimate good is that you saved actually 98% of those lives that would have died when it wasn't. And yet there's a sensation here where people latch on to the machine. I think it just propagates, Joe, your point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You say it throws rationality out the window, because it's like, that's kind of what we're talking about.
You have a question over here or a comment? Well, let me kind of invert the question and ask, like, does it really matter if an AI has empathy or not? Like, what are we solving for at the end of the day, right? Like, what is it supposed to do? Huh? Yeah, but I mean, why would, I guess, do we want it to have empathy or does it matter, right? And so I think it depends on the goal of what you're trying to do.
I think it's kind of a branch, right? Like
Yeah.
if I'm going to give my kind of 2 cents there, I do think empathy matters. I do think that there's proxies for it. I think your point is valid. Like if you study people's faces, like this happened at Carnegie Mellon quite a bit, right? Like let me see people's responses in their face, and if they're happy, right, and then sentiment through visual. I do want Tyler's take on this as well because, like, again, you play in this space, but like I think that there's that. Then there's kind of the sequence. Let's take a sequence of a conversation and you have escalation in sentiment score or a de-escalation in sentiment score. Now you're kind of saying, hey, this person's cooling down, this person's heating up. And now you can kind of analyze things. So I do think that there's ways to manufacture proxy for empathy, but there is something about a hug. Like there's lots of studies about hugs. Like what is the effect of a hug, right? Physiologically, right? And I think that that is a very hard thing to reproduce. And there's certain things that you can't accomplish from a hug that you can't when you have like just Zoom and you just say, hey, I miss you, right? And we know that, we feel that. So that, and quite frankly, I think that's what is beautiful about life. I think that there is a distinction here. And I'll talk about that in my summation at my own personal summation of when will AI make decisions.
I just want to give you a quick tidbit. So I have a golden doodle and she's really cute. And she's been spayed. She can't have kids, but she always carries around like a stuffed toy baby dog that she thinks is her kid. So she'll drag it around and like hold it and stuff. So I think it's interesting because that animal does provide I guess kind of a some sort of a comfort.
It does, but I think that this point is that you can proxy a lot of things, and we will get better at proxies. But there's kind of this barrier, and I think that's why sentience becomes such an important topic. Tyler, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the reason empathy matters is because it's a core component of trust. And we know that you go to people you trust, not people who are experts. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens. And so if you want AI to be part of your decision-making process, you have to trust it, even if it's an expert. And I think another interesting thing about trust is you're more likely to forgive mistakes if you have a foundation of belief that that person or that thing is competent. So if you go into a new company and you make a mistake out the bat, that actually hurts you. But if you go into a new company and you get success and then you make a mistake, you own up to it, people actually have more trust in you because they've seen that you can do the thing and that they see that you're willing to also admit that you have mistakes because everyone has mistakes. But if you come out the gate with the mistake, don't do that because they don't know. They haven't built this foundation of trust. And I think AI is a lot like that, which is for a lot of people, the first interaction they have is like, Tesla killed someone. Okay, we can't trust it, or ChatGPT lied to me, or whatever. You don't have this foundation of like the baseline trust is there. And then you interact with it in a way that's like, oh, it made a mistake. But actually, most of the times it doesn't. It's actually really amazing. And so I love it. And so I think with AI, if we can help it be more empathetic, we'll trust it more. And I think as more people interact with it and get success from it, they'll be more forgiving of its mistakes because that foundation will be set. Which I think for a lot of people, it's not there. They do not interact with these systems. Like Google's nice because at the end of the day, you're driving it. Google search, you kind of blame yourself. Can't get a good search result. You don't really blame Google's algorithms. You blame yourself. If ChatGPT spits something back at you, you're blaming ChatGPT. You're not really blaming your prompt right now. And I think that'll change. But I think it'll be interesting to see as people build the baseline trust in these systems and then what happens in the future.
So let's keep on going down trust. Matt, you have a thought, and then Carter, I want to hear from you on this.
I'll kind of build on what Todd was saying and what you were saying, Carlos, and that is I agree that empathy is important because it makes the interactions more organic and natural, right? So chatbot, you jump on, Comcast, your internet's been out for 2 days and you're angry, and you're going to be a lot more upset maybe if the interaction with the chatbot feels very like cold and rigid as opposed to if it feels empathetic. Now the danger, how do you add empathy to these systems? Well, fundamentally, what you tend to do is train on human data, right? Data from human interactions. We already know some of the dangers of that. If you train these models on human data, then you start building in human biases like racism, like gender bias. Like, look at what happened with the Apple Card when that came out. They had inadvertently trained all this gender bias data into their system so that female applicants were getting really, really poor scores and not able to get access to any credit, which was completely crazy. And so that's the trick. As we start training in these more human characteristics, we also have to figure out how to filter out the not so great human characteristics that can come with those.
Which is a very big challenge, right? Now, how do you kind of scrub that data to like compensate for bias? It's challenging. Carter, what's your thought?
Yeah, the question that you asked, I think is very interesting because before we started today, we were standing around talking and being a criminologist and a sociologist, context matters a lot in terms of its effect on human decision making, its effect on crime, its effect on poverty. Context matters a lot, and so it reminds me of all of these, for example, layoffs are going on. Your HR specialist has said they have a script. You read your script. Thank you for being at the company. Done. I mean, that's what they're told to do. Like you're technically, legally, you're not supposed to account and empathize for all of these extra human characteristics that would be considered biasing towards some people and not. Well, they've got 2 kids, and so I can't really lay that person off. Well, somebody's getting screwed on that. So I think in the context of HR, maybe that inhuman AI is like, thank you for being here. We really enjoyed you. Here's your severance. If you have any questions, go to this website. So I think there could be some trust in that, and I know this is being recorded. My parents, if they ever see this, they're going to kill me. But I grew up in South Dakota, and South Dakota right now, they're trying to get a law passed, and I think Wyoming's doing something similar. Is that you can't sell Teslas in South Dakota. And I mean, when I go back to my small town. I grew up in a town of like 1,500 people. And I go back and I'm like, I can't believe I'm from here. This is so insane. But their lack of trust in Tesla and automatic driving cars and all of that is just incredible. Because that type of AI represents a life that they don't recognize at all. It represents California. It represents wealth. It represents something else. And the one time the AI didn't work, so they don't trust it. But I also think of how many times do you throw your family out because they got into a big wreck and it was their fault. And I don't trust you anymore. You're not coming to Christmas. I think that trust factor is so different between humans and AI. And I think this speaks to how we do research in the tech industry as well. Stats is 95% confidence intervals. You're relatively certain your point estimate is right. But if you're wrong, stats is crap. Bunch of garbage. Can't trust it, can't trust the data. But yet you'll make gut feeling human decisions all the time in business. And that's more trustworthy. So I think we're getting there.
So I want to ask a question about Google Maps, Apple traffic, which is an interesting one. I was in Nevada. Let me tell a story first, then we can kind of go through this thought experiment. But we were driving to San Diego from Utah, and we went through Nevada, middle of nowhere, and the traffic thing came up. We were stuck in traffic, and it said, hey, if you take this route, you'll save 20 minutes. And so this, cruising van and us, we like peel it for the exit, and we go. And it leads us straight to a dirt road that we had to turn back from. And then we had 30 more minutes of delay. And I remember thinking, I will never use Google Maps in Nevada ever again in the middle of nowhere, which is an interesting thing with trust. Because now I've contextualized. Would I use it in Utah where I know the roads? Probably, but at the same time, am I likely to use it? Maybe not. I think I know better sometimes in the traffic thing, right? And there is a context of trust as well that's interesting. I will never use it in the middle of Nevada again because I feel like it will take me to a dirt road again. And yet, this isn't really that advanced. GPS has been around for how long now, right? Like for the consumer, it's been 20, 25 years. And traffic predictions, right, and routes are interesting. And there are a lot of research articles, if you look on the web, where it questions actually the intent and the optimization equation anyway. Is it for climate change? And that actually was kind of a Google article about this. Like, they're actually not taking the fastest route. They're just really trying to mitigate carbon emissions, which is fine, but you want to know that, right? And you kind of want to get to places fast. So then you're kind of questioning whether or not you should use the traffic route anyway and the detour. But for Nevada, I'm not going to use it.
I'll give you an example that happened to me yesterday. I was on my way to get my global entry interview. Who's done that before? Yeah, you have to go to the airport, right, and talk to customs. So yeah, Apple Maps takes me clear to some neighborhood in West Valley, and I'm like, this doesn't seem like the right place at all. Maybe they had an office in somebody's house or something. So luckily, I had time to book it back to the airport. But the customs guy was like, yeah, I mean, you were late. I wouldn't be talking to you. And so it's interesting because there's a couple of things. One, the map was wrong, AI. Two, this person has no empathy whatsoever for your situation. There's like, if you're late, you're late. Could care less.
So on that, I think that like the topic then trust. Let's kind of dig into the technical aspect of trust. Like, what do you need to do to gain more trust then? Like, we've talked about, some data quality elements, trustworthiness, things here. But like, I think there's an important part of decision making that you cannot mitigate. Trust, right? And Tyler, you talked about this already a little bit, but let's kind of expound upon this. If you want to make better decisions, then you need to trust more in the output. And it not only is a contextualized thing like my Nevada example, but the other part of that is history matters here. Just like human relationships, if somebody burns you on something, are you willing to do business with them again? You have to build the trust back up. You have to build the relationship back up, right? That's not any different. So how would that be different than the computer or AI? And then how do you then resolve that issue? How do you resolve these biases? How do you, what is the step that organizations should take? Everybody in this room should take in their own organizations to start instilling trust in what is currently not even when AI is not even integrated. How many times does a CEO just lean over to the CFO and say, I see all these dashboards, but what do you think? Basically rendering all of the dashboards useless because it's all trust anyway. And it's basically based on a model of, I don't want to go to jail. CFO, we're linked in this together, so you tell me what to do. I trust you more than I trust any of this data operation that we set up. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point about like trust is one, data doesn't make decisions. I think it's important to realize, which some people think is like, if you just get enough data, the decision's going to magically appear to you. Like you have to take zero risk. You've now accumulated enough data and with certainty if you go this way, you will be successful. Anyone that's worked in product and tech knows that's just not true. Anyone that's worked in statistics also knows that's not true. You have to apply some filter on top of the data. And so decision making is important. I also think part of it's control. Why do people not love flying in airplanes? I think a lot of it's because they don't feel like they have control over their destiny. And not everyone's not like this, but I think also decision making is like that as well. As like you're more likely, I think, to be comfortable with a decision you feel in control of as opposed to a decision you don't feel in control of, which is like turning it over to an AI system. But I think the way you try to build trust, if you're trying to do this for your company, and there's a spectrum, right? If you're looking at your company, you're like, yeah, I get that, but we won't even look at the data. We're just out there like, woo, we're making decisions. Get a win out the bat, right? You want to come to them with data that makes a good decision. To my previous point, you don't want your first experience with data or AI to be bad because that's way harder to come back from. Once you start building up some of those reps of good decisions, it's a lot easier to then make a mistake. So start simple, make a good decision with data, make it clear that the data helped. But I think it's also important to realize that you still are never going to get to this point where it's riskless. Data is a risk mitigation factor. It doesn't go to zero, though. You can't get to this place where you just have enough data to have a perfect prediction of the future, at least not yet. You have to, at some point, make a decision with that data.
And I'll follow that on quickly to say that in general, humans, even those of us who work in the data profession and work in statistics and work in prediction, have a very hard time thinking statistically and probabilistically versus deterministically. So we still like to think that if the machine tells us to make a particular decision, that's absolutely the right decision. But more and more what it might be saying is that like there's a 60% probability that this is right and there's a 40% probability that this other thing will happen and that this will be wrong. But this is the most optimized choice, and we'll see what actually happens. There's no evidence that we're ever going to be able to fully predict the future because even in physics models, like even when you have very precise simulations, you can see that they'll go in very different directions if you just change the noise in the model.
I mean, I'll tell you a story about that. Like,
yeah, go for it.
Sort of about that. But, back, I got hired at a company to set up a forecasting system for them in, August of 2008. So anyone remember what happened the next month? Right. So forecasting really wouldn't work then because the world had changed, right? And so, but what was interesting is some people really felt like we should keep trusting the machine, keep trusting the output of it, right? But if you measure that against what happens in reality, you can tell automatically what's going to happen, right? And so it was an interesting exercise where I think people wanted to sort of abdicate their decision making to some third party, and a lot of this is frankly CYA, the acronym. If you're not the one making the decision, it's the machine making it, not me. What am I supposed to do here, right? Stupid machines. But these are very costly consequences. I don't need to remind you what happened in 2008 with respect to the downturn and subsequent layoffs and the pure carnage that happened at the time. But it was really interesting just because I felt like people were really scared for their jobs, and so they really wanted to outsource the decision making to something that was not them. So it's fascinating to see. We saw, I think, another example of this in COVID, right? Where the bottom fell out under the economy around March and April. I think we were all there, I hope. But again, what was interesting is when you talk to, especially data professionals, the odd thing was I kind of got a mix of responses where some people were definitely like, yeah, we need to go back and trust our gut and trust our domain expertise, right? And this is the one thing that I was talking with Matt about this on the drive over. Domain expertise is one of these things where you're not going to really be able to capture those experiences in an AI model. I don't know how you could, but it's going to be very difficult to do it in a way that's scalable. And so, what Matt and I are talking about, with AI and trust is really sort of what happens with the hybrid of chess players and chess AI right now, right? Like the best player is like actually the combination of using AI and grandmaster in chess. But I think that's sort of the duality. But it also assumes, chess masters are able to work with AI because they know how chess works, right? I think that the largest gap that Matt and I see over and over again is the lack of data literacy and just knowledge about how data works at even a fundamental level. Basic stats. How many people here know understand statistics? Right? Not everybody. Not even close. So that's what I'm saying. You're relying on these outputs. You have no idea what went into that and how it made that decision, right? So this is, and you can always make the argument, yeah, you drive an automatic car, you have no idea how your car works, right? But these, so I don't know.
Let me add one more thing on the topic of trust, and that is going back to this notion of empathy. We as humans have this ability to personify inanimate objects. In other words, we can start to think of them as being kind of human. And fortunately or unfortunately, that also has quite a bit to do with our trust and empathy, right? We feel like if this thing is human, then I can relate to it. And so one way to make AI systems at least feel more trustworthy is to make them behave in a more human-like manner so that people interact with them and feel like they're talking to a person. Then the question becomes, is that actually desirable? Is it desirable that you interact with the chatbot and you feel like you're talking to a human or not? Yeah. That's true. Yeah, they're designed to be personified, very much so.
Yeah, real quick. I think, my experience in the tech industry is that a lot of times why you don't see so much trust in organizations at the upper echelons, we're talking C-suites, SVPs, EVPs, is because you don't have data representation at that level. That's been one of my biggest frustrations of coming into the tech industry is that, I know what I'm doing. Tyler knows what he's doing. Matt, Carlos, Joe, they all know what they're doing. But if you're not sitting at your company or you don't have a boss who he or she gets to represent your group in the boardroom and at the executive table for discussion, the level of trust that they will have in AI and really hardcore statistics and machine learning will be the level that they are educated at. Okay? Because so much of these decision making, there's hubris and there is ego when it comes to, I'm going to make this big bad decision for this company and take it this other direction. I've been told in my career, I don't care what your model says, you're wrong. And I just watched a product tank and I was like, I told you so. But if you don't have that representation at the upper echelons of your company, you are going to have a tough existence and you'll be really frustrated because you know what you can do. But you've got to try to build that trust somehow, but you'll get capped. But you want to see those companies that are like, our CTO has a really strong data science background, or you actually have a chief data officer, or they've handed the vaulted title of chief data scientist somewhere, and they make it part of the process. Because if you're selling it right, you're not walking into an executive room and saying, I'm here to make you a better decision maker. You should walk in and respect the subject matter expert and say, I'm also going to put some data alongside it. So when you're making your decisions, you've got your subject matter expertise, and you've also got some quantitative data behind it as well.
Great. I think we have time for 1 minute each to kind of wrap up on the actual question that we have above on this board, the topic of this conversation. I mean, we've talked a lot about these inputs, these influencing things. But Joe, why don't we start with you, and then Tyler, and then we'll have Matt, and then Carter, and then I'll end. But let's take about a minute and answer the question: when will AI replace decision making based on our conversation today?
Fascinating question. I would say never. As long as you feel you have your own volition in this world. But I would say it's a spectrum of the type of decision making that AI might replace. And so, I mean, going back to the maps example, I don't know anybody who memorizes directions anymore. I don't know anyone who memorizes phone numbers. That would be very odd, right? So, you've outsourced some of that stuff. But I would say, it won't replace everything, but it'll replace probably a lot of the tedium in your life.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. The interesting thing about all these topics is they're pretty well studied. So if you want to become a better decision maker, you can read books, research principles. There are principles around this. And I don't think AI is there to replace the principles of decision making. It's there to make good decision making easier. And so I don't think it's going to ever replace decision making. But I think it can help augment the process, maybe make it more scalable, more automated. Maybe one of the things it does is it calls your BS for you, which is you're not following the right principles around decision making. One of which is just off the top of my head is outcome bias is a real thing with decisions. Bad outcomes don't always mean bad decisions. You could have made the best decision and it led to a bad outcome because it's probabilistic, right? And good outcomes don't always mean good decisions. I think we're all very familiar with that. You look at some companies how did they succeed? Who knows? But lots of bad decisions led to some good outcomes for some people. And so I don't think decision-making is a thing that can be replaced. Unless you're really just being run by an AI, which maybe that would happen. Maybe some companies would just literally be run by an AI system. Then maybe it would replace decision-making. But at the end of the day, decision is a process. And I think it can be augmented by technology. And I think more and more of that will happen. But I don't think it will ever be outsourced completely. Self-driving, if we get it right, you could imagine never driving again. I don't know if you'd ever be running a company, be I'm not making any decisions. AI, and at that point, you're not running the company. So,
Yeah, just to follow on to this discussion, I think there are two aspects to this, really. There's the technology aspect and the cultural aspect. And you guys have already touched on these both. But yeah, you can see with ChatGPT, it's doing amazing things, but it's a long, long way from being able to make reliable decisions. Having said that, we keep seeing these miraculous leaps in technology. Next leap could happen in 6 months or 5 years or 10 years, where these machines get much, much better at making decisions from a lot of language data and a lot of human interaction. Then there's the second part, which is the cultural aspect. And that is that, just as you were saying, even now, boards and CEOs aren't actually making good data-driven decisions. And so even if we have tools that could make really good decisions, are we going to use them? That remains an open question.
Yeah, I'm very aligned with Tyler. I really see the promise of it's augmenting human decision making. I really truly believe that, and that's why I think something like ChatGPT and you're going to see it go more vertical. I mean, I think that if you really start to feed it specific data, this is one of the reasons I loved BERT so much. Really well trained, you could do all kinds of cool stuff with it. But you could add your own layer to it and say, now we want to create an Entrata BERT based off the chats that we have with our customers. I think you'll see AI going way more vertical because I'll give you an example really quick here. I typed into GPT or Chat GPT, how do I set the right price elasticity for Entrata customers when they're trying to rent their units at an optimal price to maximize revenue and maximizes demand? And this is the response that it gave to me. It says, to determine the price elasticity for rental units for Entrata customers, you can conduct a survey of current or potential renters to gather data on how changes in rental prices would affect their demand for the units. So basically, I kind of repeated my question back to me. You also can use historical data on rental prices and occupancy rates to estimate price elasticity. That's why I have a job. And then additionally, you can consult with industry experts, #me, to research to get an understanding of rental market trends and factors. So it will give you like good talking points if you were doing a presentation, but the actual execution of how do I do this, we're a long ways from that. But if you had ChatGPT that was trained specifically for Entrata problems and it augmented, like Tyler said, I think that's the future.
Great. And I'll keep my comment short. But I think that it is when optimization of the system happens. That's actually a big part of the mission of DrumCV, which is to optimize people, process, and AI. And when that happens, now we're starting to get somewhere with decision making. But if you filled out the study, you probably noticed, like most other people in the world that have filled out the study, very few people have put anything on the top line, which is I trust 100% my decision to AI. You see that consequential is in the bottom right most of the time. A marriage decision, a college decision, that's much more you want control over that. And when trust and when historical accumulation of trust happens, you are more likely to entrust AI with more decisions over time. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Carter. Thank you guys for coming. And hopefully we can see you again at a future event. Thank you.
from the people and places around me. Our kiln series of furniture is bespoke made and designed by myself specifically for kiln. My hope with kiln is that when people come into the space, they appreciate the environment and it gives them an opportunity to do their best work. Our spaces are designed to enable communication. When I'm designing a kiln space, my first thought is how to really build on collaboration of the people using the space. As collaboration is such an important part of